This isn't a charity ward, Ms. Adeyemi. Please take your discount insurance elsewhere. Dr. Richard Hale's voice sliced through the clinical stillness of the private suite like a scalpel. His tone carried the practiced, frigid weight of a man who spent his days deciding who was worthy of his time, and who was merely a drain on his resources. He didn't bother to look up from Blessing's file at first, his movements sharp and dismissive as he leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes eventually landing on her 34-week bump with a flicker of unmistakable disdain. The harsh fluorescent lights of the upscale office bounced off the glass-fronted cabinets of expensive equipment, making the sterile room feel less like a place of healing and more like an interrogation chamber. How did someone with your credentials even secure an appointment at a Tier 1 facility? Hale continued. His professional mask had vanished, replaced by the raw classism he'd been masking since Blessing walked in. Blessing's hands moved instinctively to cradle her belly, her fingers spreading protectively over the spot where her son moved restlessly. A wave of panic rose in her throat, but she swallowed it down. Years of navigating a system that viewed her as a statistic had taught her to mask her fear with a quiet, unyielding dignity. She refused to give a man like Hale the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. But her baby felt the spike of adrenaline. The little one kicked hard against her ribs, a sharp reminder that she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. I have a scheduled checkup, Blessing said, her voice soft but carefully measured. She pronounced every word with the hard-won precision of someone who knew that any slip in her Nigerian accent would be used as a weapon against her. My referral was processed weeks ago. My record should be right there in front of you. She kept her gaze fixed on him, even as her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her sternum. Every instinct she possessed screamed that this room was no longer safe. The shift from the sterile hostility of the exam room to the memory of the penthouse balcony was like stepping from a freezer into the warm Lagos sun. Blessing remembered the first time she had really seen him, not as the cold businessman the media obsessed over, but as the man who sat across from her, meticulously peeling a piece of fruit as if it were the most important task in the world. They had met 3 years ago, a chance encounter that had bloomed into a love that defied every logic of their two separate worlds. Seo Min-jae was a man of few words and deep shadows. To the public, he was the architect, a visionary real estate mogul who had transformed the city's skyline with glass and steel. But in certain circles, the ones whispered about in the back alleys of Itaewon and the luxury gambling halls of Macau, the title held a different weight. He was the man who built empires, yes, but he was also the man who designed the systems of loyalty and consequence that kept those empires standing. He was the architect of a world where family was the only unbreakable rule, and to threaten his was to invite a structural collapse of one's entire life. Blessing had known his world was complicated, that his business interests often crossed lines into territories she preferred not to explore in detail. Their arrangement was built on a foundation of protective silence. He kept her shielded from the violence of his profession, and in return, she provided the only peace he had ever known. He was the man who had held her through the nightmares of her immigration journey, who had learned to cook her favorite Nigerian dishes even when his hands were built for more ruthless work, and who had wept openly the first time he felt their son kick beneath her skin. I will make this world safe for you, Blessing, he had whispered in Korean on the night they found out she was pregnant. She had smiled then, thinking he meant the comforts of their home. She hadn't fully realized that Min-jae's definition of safe involved a level of surveillance and control that turned the city into his personal chessboard. He had quietly installed the security systems in this very hospital, not out of a desire for profit, but as a condition of his funding, ensuring that even when he wasn't by her side, his eyes never left her. As she stood in the office now, facing Dr. Hale's sneer, she didn't know that Min-jae had just closed his phone 3 floors below, his face transforming into a mask of silk-covered steel as he watched the live feed of the doctor's hand reaching for her arm. The architect was no longer building. He was ready to dismantle. Dr. Hale didn't return to his seat. Instead, he began to circle the examination table with a predatory slowness, the heels of his Italian leather shoes clicking against the linoleum with a rhythm that made Blessing's skin crawl. He clutched her file like a weapon, his eyes darting from the basic plan insurance card on the counter back to Blessing's face, which remained a mask of measured calm despite the hammering in her chest. Let's be honest for a moment, Ms. Adeyemi, Hale said. his voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone that felt like a layer of grease. A woman in your position with this level of coverage doesn't just stumble into a private VIP wing on a Tuesday morning. He stopped directly in front of her, leaning in close enough for Blessing to smell the expensive, overwhelming scent of his cologne. Who is the man paying for this? Or is there even a man at all? The questions hit Blessing like physical blows, landing in the space behind her eyes where tears threatened to gather. Hale's lip curled in a smirk as he noted her silence, his professional mask fully discarded to reveal the monster underneath. I've seen your type 1,000 times. You find some man with deep pockets to tell you you're special, and you think that entitles you to premium care you haven't earned, he sneered, making a performative mark on her clipboard that nearly tore through the paper. Does he even know about this baby? Or are you just playing the charity case until the real bills arrive? Blessing felt her son move violently against her ribs, sensing the sharp spike of her stress. She placed both hands flat against her belly, trying to project a calm she didn't feel to the tiny human depending on her. My husband will be here any moment, she said, her Nigerian accent thickening as her patience finally began to fray at the edges. He is merely retrieving something from the car. I suggest we wait for him before you continue this audit of my personal life. Hale's laugh was sharp and humorless, the kind of sound that didn't belong in a place dedicated to healing. A husband? Please. I'm sure he's exactly the kind of man who promises the world but leaves women like you to deal with the consequences alone, he mocked. He stepped even closer, his shadow looming over her as he prepared to deliver the final insult. I want the truth. How did you really get into my system, Blessing? Because someone like you doesn't belong here, and I intend to find out exactly who let you through the door. The air in the office grew heavy, thick with the scent of Hale's expensive perfume and the silent, mounting terror of a woman trapped. Blessing didn't stand and she didn't run. She knew that fleeing would be a silent admission that Hale was right, that she was an intruder in a space meant for her protection. Instead, she looked up at him, her eyes steady despite the tremor in her hands. Did I do something wrong? She asked, her Nigerian accent carrying the weight of every immigrant who had ever been told they were out of place. Hale's face twisted into something ugly, a sneer that stripped away his decades of medical prestige to reveal a raw, unfiltered malice. Did you do something wrong? He mocked, his voice a weaponized mimicry of her tone. You walked into my suite. You sat in my chair. You thought you could demand the best of this world while offering nothing in return. He took a sharp step forward, his shadow eclipsing her entirely. Blessing tensed, her hands flying to her belly as her son kicked with a frantic, warning energy. If you won't leave voluntarily, Hale hissed, his professional mask shattered beyond repair, then I'll escort you out myself. He didn't wait for a response. His hands closed around Blessing's shoulders with a shocking, brutal strength, his manicured nails digging into her skin through the soft fabric of her dress. Blessing gasped, a sound of pure, instinctive panic, as he yanked her upward from the chair with a violence that had no place in a house of healing. Get out! He screamed, and then he pushed. Time didn't slow down. It compressed into a terrifying, jagged fraction of a second. Blessing understood with perfect, crystalline clarity that her center of gravity had been stolen, that her pregnant body could not compensate for the force of his hatred. She was falling backward, the trajectory certain, the linoleum floor rising to meet her. In that moment, her brain stopped calculating her own safety. It sent a single desperate command to her muscles: protect the baby. Her arms wrapped tightly around her stomach, an instinctive shield as old as motherhood itself, as she prepared for the impact that threatened to shatter her world before it even began. The door to the exam room didn't just open. It vanished, rebounding against the wall with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Before Blessing's shoulders could meet the cold linoleum, the world stopped tilting. Strong, familiar arms caught her waist with practiced precision, pulling her backward against a solid chest that radiated a terrifying, controlled heat. Her weight was redistributed so smoothly that her falling momentum transformed into a steady, grounded embrace. Blessing looked up, her vision blurred by tears of sheer relief, and saw the face of the man who had built a kingdom on the promise of her safety. Seo Menje wasn't a large man, but he carried a presence that seemed to drain the air from the room. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, emphasizing the lean muscle beneath, and his face was arranged in an expression of absolute Arctic calm, a silence far more dangerous than any scream. "Are you hurt?" he asked in Korean, his voice as soft as silk and twice as sharp. His hands remained on her waist, steadying her, his touch a gentle contrast to the lethal energy vibrating through his frame. Blessing could only shake her head, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she clutched her belly. The baby was kicking frantically, responding to the chaos, and she whispered his name like a prayer. Min-jae's gaze finally drifted upward to Dr. Hale, who had backed into his mahogany desk, his hands gripping the edge as if the wood could protect him from the storm that had just walked through his door. The doctor's face had gone a sickly, translucent white, all his arrogance evaporating as he looked past Min-jae to the doorway. Standing there were two men who didn't belong in a hospital. They were silent, disciplined shadows, Seo's enforcers. They didn't move and they didn't speak. They simply occupied the space where the exit used to be, their presence an absolute guarantee that no one was leaving room 304 without permission. Min-jae didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "My name is Seo Min-jae," he said, holding Blessing close as if she were the only precious thing left in a world he was about to burn. "And I believe you were just explaining to my wife why she doesn't belong in this building." Dr. Hale's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his professional poise replaced by the panicked gasping of a man drowning on dry land. He glanced at the phone on his desk, but before his hand could even twitch toward the receiver, Min-jae's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Go ahead," Min-jae invited, his tone terrifyingly soft. "Call security. I'm sure they'll be fascinated to explain why they allowed an assault to occur in a building I funded." Hale froze. "You funded?" he stammered, his eyes darting to the expensive art and the mahogany paneling of his office. Min-jae didn't blink. He pulled a small tablet from the pocket of his charcoal suit and tapped the screen, turning it to face the doctor. The display glowed with a grid of high-definition video feeds, one of which showed a bird's-eye view of room 304. On the screen, the playback was already rolling. Hale's sneer was captured in crystalline detail. His hands were seen yanking Blessing upward. The violent push that had nearly sent her to the floor was documented in a resolution so sharp it felt like a physical blow. "I don't just provide funding, Dr. Hale," Min-jae said, his Korean accent carrying a hint of the streets he had conquered. "I own the deed to this land. I own the steel in these walls. And most importantly, I own the security system you've spent the last 20 minutes ignoring." He gestured subtly to a tiny, recessed lens in the corner of the ceiling, a camera Hale had walked under every day for years without a second thought. "These are my cameras," Min-jae continued, his hands tightening almost imperceptibly around Blessing's shoulders as he felt her tremble. "High-definition audio and video, backed up to a private server that you cannot delete. Everything you said to my wife, every mockery of her insurance, every insult to her dignity, and finally your hands on her body, it is all recorded. It is all evidence." Hale's knees finally gave way, and he sank into his leather chair, the very throne of authority he had used to belittle Blessing now feeling like a cage. He looked at the screen, watching himself commit professional suicide in a loop. The cheap patient he had tried to throw out was the only person in the room who held his life in her hands, and the architect was already beginning to pull the first brick from the foundation of his world. Min-jae didn't look at the tablet as his head of security. Kim stepped forward to present the scrolling data. His focus remained entirely on Blessing, his thumb tracing a calming circle on her hand as he signaled for the destruction to begin. "Dr. Hale, you seem to believe you are an asset to this institution," Min-jae said, his voice a low melodic threat that made the air in the office feel thin. "But my team has spent the last 5 minutes looking into the assets you've hidden in administrative black holes." Kim tapped the tablet, and a series of redacted legal documents flickered onto the screen. They weren't just files, they were ghosts. 7 formal complaints of medical negligence in the last 4 years, Kim reported, his voice devoid of emotion. Common themes include the denial of pain medication to minority patients, and the intentional falsification of insurance codes to overcharge the state. Hale's face went from pale to a sickly gray as the true scope of his exposure became clear. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, protected by a system that prioritized his reputation over the lives of his patients. But Min-jae's team had bypassed the hospital's firewall with surgical precision. uncovering 3 secret settlements totaling nearly $2 million. You weren't just mocking my wife's insurance, Richard, Min-jae continued, using the doctor's first name as if it were a speck of dirt. You were using patients like her to subsidize your luxury lifestyle through systematic fraud. The forensic data revealed a pattern of ghost billing, where Hale had charged the government for procedures never performed on low-income patients while providing them with the bare minimum of care. He had turned the sacred oath of healing into a lucrative scheme, burying the evidence under a mountain of NDAs and bureaucratic favors. Blessing looked at the screen, her horror deepening with every revealed name. She wasn't just a victim of a single bad moment. She was the latest target of a predatory machine. Min-jae felt her shudder and pulled her closer. The architect does not just build, doctor, he whispered, his eyes locking onto Hale's with a promise of total erasure. I also clear the rot before I start a new foundation. The collapse of Richard Hale's world did not happen with a bang, but with the cold rhythmic ticking of a clock that had finally run out of time. Within 72 hours of Min-jae's departure from the suite, the prestigious veneer of Hale's life began to peel away in jagged strips. The State Medical Board, presented with a digital dossier of undeniable fraud and the high-definition footage of the assault, moved with a speed that left the doctor breathless. His license was suspended effective immediately, a death sentence for a man whose entire identity was built on the authority of his white coat. By Friday, the luxury apartment he shared with his wife, a woman who had spent a decade curated in silk and ignorance, fell silent. When the news broke on the local stations, featuring blurred but violent clips of the Room 304 incident, the elite circles Hale had navigated so carefully turned into a wall of ice. His peers, the men and women who had clinked glasses with him at charity galas, stopped answering his calls. His name was stripped from the donor boards of the city's most exclusive clubs. He had become a liability, a toxic ghost in the halls of power he once commanded. The financial dismantling was even more surgical. Min-jae's influence in the banking sector ensured that Hale's accounts were flagged for the very fraud his own team had uncovered. Every credit card was declined, every asset frozen pending a federal investigation into his systematic overbilling. The man who had mocked Blessing's cheap insurance now found himself unable to pay for a cup of coffee, standing in a world that no longer recognized him. He sat alone in his darkened study, surrounded by expensive furniture he no longer owned, watching a press conference where the hospital board publicly disavowed him. They spoke of equitable care and systemic reform, using his name as the shorthand for everything they were purging. Hale looked into the bathroom mirror and saw a stranger, a man whose fear had hardened into a cruelty that had finally consumed him. He had believed he was special, that he belonged in the high places, but he realized too late that he had been nothing more than a tenant in a building owned by a man he had dared to cross. The penthouse office was thick with the scent of aged cedar and the cold, vibrating energy of a man who had spent his life balancing the scales of the underworld. Seo Min-jae sat behind a desk of dark walnut, his hands folded with a terrifying, absolute stillness. Across from him, Blessing rested in a velvet armchair, her hand never leaving the place where their son moved beneath her heart. He is a ghost now, Blessing, Min-jae said, his voice as soft as a prayer and as sharp as a garrote. His money is gone. His name is a stain. But the law is a slow leaking thing. It allows for appeals. It allows for excuses. He leaned forward, the shadows of the room deepening the lines of his face. I can provide a final solution. Permanent erasure. Richard Hale would simply cease to exist in this city, or any other. No more nightmares. No more chance of him hurting anyone else. Blessing looked at her husband, the man the world called the architect. She saw the lethal loyalty in his eyes, the readiness to burn down the world to avenge the 3 seconds she had spent falling. Revenge would be effortless. It would be a phone call, a silent gesture, and the monster who had mocked her humanity would be gone. That is revenge, Min-jae, she whispered, her voice carrying the quiet strength of a woman who had survived a journey he could never truly understand. If he disappears in the dark, then the other women he hurt stay in the dark too. Maria, Aisha, Kesha, the names your team found. They need to know they weren't alone. They need to see him break under the weight of the truth, not just a shadow. She stood, her posture unyielding even in her vulnerability. I don't want him erased. I want him judged. I want to stand in that courtroom and look him in the eye while the world hears exactly what he is. Min Jae was silent for a long moment, the architect calculating the structural integrity of a world built on justice instead of blood. Then he stood and crossed the room, kissing her forehead with a gentleness that belied the power at his command. Then we will give them a performance they will never forget, he promised. Justice has to be enough, because if it's not, we are no better than the people who tried to break us. 3 months later, the sterile predatory air of room 304 had been replaced by the soft rhythmic hum of a life support system that actually lived up to its name. Blessing lay in a suite flooded with the warm golden light of a late afternoon sun, her exhaustion eclipsed by the weight of the miracle resting against her chest. Amara had been born healthy and perfect, with her mother's resilient spirit and her father's dark, watchful eyes. She was a child born into a world that had been fundamentally reshaped to receive her. A world where her existence was no longer treated as a liability, but as a triumph. Outside the room, the brass plaque in the lobby had been polished to a brilliant shine, but the name Clearwater was gone. In its place, engraved in deep permanent letters, was the Adeyemi Maternal Health Center. It was no longer a facility that prioritized reputation over humanity. Under federal oversight and Min Jae's uncompromising stewardship, the hospital had been rebuilt into a sanctuary for the underserved. The new administration had implemented mandatory anti-bias training and a transparent, independent review board for patient complaints, ensuring that the 23 voices Sandra and Hale had silenced would be the last to ever go unheard. Co Min Jae stood by the window, watching the city he had once viewed only as a series of structures to be conquered. He was still the architect, but his focus had shifted from the cold geometry of power to the delicate preservation of peace. He walked to the bedside and reached down, his large scarred hand trembling slightly as he touched Amara's tiny foot. "She will never have to ask if she belongs," he murmured, his voice thick with a raw, honest emotion that few in his world would ever recognize. Blessing smiled, covering his hand with hers. She thought of Richard Hale, currently serving his 18-month sentence in a world that had forgotten his name, and felt no bitterness, only a profound, quiet sense of closure. The courtroom battle had been grueling, but standing on that witness stand had transformed her from a victim into a catalyst for change. She had chosen justice over revenge, and in doing so, she had built a legacy for her daughter that was stronger than any empire. As the sun set over the city, casting long, peaceful shadows across the room, Blessing knew that the architect's greatest work wasn't the building they were in, but the safe, equitable world their daughter would now inherit.